Ma'am, I'm going to need you to head back downstairs. This floor is for attorneys and court personnel only. Defendants and their families check in on the first floor. He said it without really looking at her, the way a man talks to someone he has already filed away in his head. A well-dressed black woman in a charcoal coat stood in the quiet marble hallway outside the judge's chambers, a leather bag over her shoulder, and the young prosecutor in the expensive suit stepped smoothly into her path. And when she said calmly that she had business on this floor, he let out a small, patient sigh, the sigh of a man very used to explaining things to people he considered slow. "I'm sure you feel like you do," he said, "but this really isn't the place for you. What are you here for exactly?" He looked her up and down, one slow, appraising pass. "Let me guess. Whatever it is, they'll call your name downstairs. Believe me, this is not where your kind of business gets handled. Have you ever been told in a building you had every right to walk into that you were standing somewhere you did not belong? Have you ever watched a stranger look at your face and decide, before you had said a single word, that you were the kind of person who ends up on the wrong side of the law? In 20 minutes, that same young prosecutor was going to walk into courtroom 4B, straighten his silk tie, and rise to argue the most important case of his young career. And the bailiff was going to say, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Yvette Coleman." And the woman he had just tried to send downstairs, the woman he had looked up and down and decided was a defendant, was going to walk out in a black robe and climb the steps to the highest seat in that room and sit down and look straight at him. Stay with me. You are going to want to see his face when she takes the bench. Her name was Yvette Coleman. She was 52 years old, and she had spent 30 years of her life earning the right to sit exactly where that young man was about to find her sitting. Let me take you back, because a judge like Yvette Coleman is not an accident. She was forged deliberately out of a specific wound, and to understand the woman in the charcoal coat, you have to understand a summer night when she was 11 years old. Yvette grew up in a small house on a street the city liked to forget, the daughter of a man named Samuel Coleman. Samuel worked at a warehouse, loading trucks. 30 years on the same concrete floor, a quiet, gentle, deeply honest man who read his Bible at the kitchen table and never in his life took a thing that was not his. He used to tell his daughter that a man's name was the only thing he truly owned, and that you could lose everything else and rebuild it. But a name, once it was taken from you, was very hard to get back. Yvette did not understand how much he meant it until the summer she was 11. That summer, a large sum of money went missing from the warehouse office, and the men who ran that warehouse did not look very hard for who took it, because the easiest answer was already standing on the loading dock, and the easiest answer had dark skin. They accused Samuel Coleman. There was no evidence, because he had done nothing, but evidence was not really the point. He was arrested in front of his co-workers. And when the families scraped together what little they had and went looking for a lawyer, they found the thing that poor people always find, which is that justice has a price tag. And theirs was a public defender with 200 other cases who met Samuel for 11 minutes and told him the truth of his situation. The truth was that a black warehouse worker with no money, accused by his white employers, was going to lose in front of that jury no matter what actually happened, and that the prosecutor was offering a deal, and that if Samuel took the deal, he would serve a year, and if he fought it and lost, which he would, he could serve 10. So Samuel Coleman, an innocent man, sat in a courtroom, and he looked at his wife and his little girl in the gallery, and he stood up, and he said the word guilty about a thing he did not do. Because the system had done the math for him, and the math said that his innocence was worth less than the risk of proving it. He took the year. He came home to a family that knew the truth, and a neighborhood that only knew the record, and something in him never fully stood back up. The real thief, a manager, was quietly caught 2 years later stealing again. There was no parade for Samuel. There was no apology. There was just a man who had learned that his name, the only thing he truly owned, could be taken from him in an afternoon by people who never even bothered to learn it. 11-year-old Yvette Coleman sat in that gallery and watched her gentle father say guilty, and she made a decision that day that she did not have the words for yet. She decided that she was going to become the person who was not in that courtroom the day her father needed one. The fair face on the high seat, the one who would make them prove it. The one who would look at a frightened man and see a man, and not a color, and not a record, and not the easy answer. She was 11, and she pointed her whole life at that bench like an arrow, and she never once let it drift. Remember that. She did not want power. She wanted to be the thing her father never got, and the price of that arrow was everything you would expect and more. Yvette was the only black girl in the honors track at her school, and a counselor advised her kindly to aim for something more realistic than law. She worked 2 jobs through college and 3 through law school, and she graduated near the top of a class full of people whose parents had paid their way. And then she spent 25 years in courtrooms as a lawyer, and in all 25 of those years, in courthouse after courthouse, she was mistaken for the defendant, the interpreter, the court reporter, the cleaning staff, anything at all except the attorney she was. She lost count of the number of times a bailiff directed her to the gallery, or a fellow lawyer handed her a coat, or a client walked past her looking for their black female attorney and could not believe the black woman in the good suit standing right in front of them was the one. She learned to say her title first and fast. She learned to arrive early and stand at counsel's table before anyone came in, because if she was already standing where the lawyers stood, it was a little harder for them to send her to sit where they had already decided she belonged. A little harder. Never impossible. There was one afternoon early on that she never told anyone about for years. She had just won a difficult case, a real victory, the kind you remember. And she was walking out of the courtroom, still carrying the lightness of it. And an older attorney she did not know fell into step beside her and asked, warmly, whether she was the stenographer, because he had a job coming up and was looking for someone reliable. She had just out-argued 3 lawyers who looked like him, and she smiled, and she gave him her card, and she went home and sat in her car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before she could drive. Not crying, just sitting, letting the old familiar cold move through her and out the other side, the way you wait out a wave, twice as good to be counted half as much, and even then the counting was done by other people. The same lesson her father learned on the loading dock, handed down like an heirloom she never asked for and could not seem to put down. And then, after 30 years, she did the impossible thing. She was appointed to the bench. Judge Yvette Coleman, the fair face on the high seat, exactly the thing 11-year-old Yvette had aimed herself at across 4 decades. And on the morning this story takes place, she had a particular reason to be early and a particular weight in her chest, because today, for the very first time, her father was coming to watch her work. Samuel Coleman was 78 now, stooped and slow, his hands not what they were, but his mind was clear and his eyes still filled when he looked at his daughter. He had never once set foot in a courtroom since the day he said guilty. He could not make himself do it. The building itself frightened something in him. But Yvette had asked him gently for months to come and see her preside just once, to sit in a courtroom and watch his own daughter be the judge, so that the last memory that building gave him would not be the worst day of his life. And that morning, at last, he had put on his good suit, the same suit he wore to church, and he had let his daughter's driver bring him downtown. And he was, at that very moment, being helped to a seat in the gallery of courtroom 4B, an old man come to replace a wound with something like healing. That is why Yvette Coleman was early. That is why she was walking the quiet hallway to her chambers in her charcoal coat, her robe waiting on its hook inside, when a young prosecutor named Spencer Vaughan stepped into her path and told her that people like her got their business handled downstairs. Spencer Vaughan was 40 years old, and he was good, and he knew it, and this was the thing that had rotted him. He had a conviction record he was proud of, and an eye on higher office, and he had a very specific idea of what belonged on the fourth floor of that courthouse, and a black woman he did not recognize did not fit it. He did not stop to check the picture in his head against the person in front of him. Almost nobody ever does. That is the whole mechanism of the thing. He simply moved to correct what he assumed was a stray, a lost defendant. A family member wandered up from arraignment, and he did it with the casual, bottomless confidence of a man who had never once in his life been mistaken for anything less than what he was. Yvette looked at him for a long moment. She had a lifetime of practice at this exact moment. She said quietly, "I have business in courtroom 4B. And Spencer, hearing the very courtroom he was about to appear in, smiled a little because of course she did. They always claimed to have business, and he said 4B is it. That's my courtroom this morning. Big case. He said it to put her in her place. And I promise you, whatever's got your name on the docket, showing up early and wandering the wrong floor is not going to help you. Now," he gestured back toward the elevators, "downstairs, before I have to call someone." A young court clerk named Bailey, passing with an armful of files, slowed and said uncertainly, "Mr. Vaughan, I don't think," and Spencer waved her off without looking, the way powerful men wave off the small voice of a conscience that is not their own. And Bailey, 24 and new and afraid of him, went quiet and hurried on, and would carry the shame of that silence for a long time. Yvette Coleman did not raise her voice. She did not tell him who she was. She simply looked at the young man one more moment, and then she stepped around him, and she walked to the tall door at the end of the hall, the one with her own name on a brass plate he had not bothered to read, and she went inside and closed it. And Spencer Vaughan stood there for a second, feeling vaguely that something had not gone the way it should. And then he shrugged it off and went to prepare for court, because men like him do not spend much time wondering about people they have already filed away. And here is the moment I think about the most. Not the reveal. It is coming, and it is everything you want it to be. This one first, because inside her chambers, with the door closed, Judge Yvette Coleman set down her leather bag, and she stood for a moment in the quiet, and she did not reach for her robe. She reached instead for the small framed photograph she kept on her desk, the one she looked at before every hard day. It was a picture of her father as a young man, Samuel Coleman at 30, strong and unbroken, before the warehouse and the accusation and the word guilty, grinning at a camera with his whole life ahead of him. And Yvette looked at that photograph, and something in her chest that she had spent 52 years holding very still began, quietly, to shake. Because she had done everything. She had pointed her entire life at that bench, and she had hit it, dead center, against odds that should have been impossible. She wore the robe. She held the gavel. She was, by every measure the world claimed to respect, at the very top of the profession that had once ground her father into the floor. And she had walked into her own courthouse on the one morning her father had finally found the courage to come and see her. And a stranger had taken one look at her face and decided, in half a second, that she was a defendant, that her business got handled downstairs, that she was still, after everything, the wrong kind of person on the right kind of floor. 30 years, the robe on the hook, her father in the gallery, and the first thing the world still saw when it looked at Yvette Coleman was a woman who belonged in the dock. She let one tear fall, just one. She had learned, like her father, to keep the rest, and then she wiped it away with the back of her hand. And she looked at the young man in the photograph, her father before the world got to him, and she said out loud in the empty chambers, "We're not doing this the small way." And she took her robe off the hook, and she put it on, and Judge Yvette Coleman became entirely the fair face on the high seat that an 11-year-old girl had promised the world it would one day have to look at. Courtroom 4B was full that morning. It was a serious case, and the gallery was crowded. And somewhere in the third row, an old man in a church suit sat with his hands folded in his lap. Looking around a courtroom he had not been able to enter in 40 years, his heart going hard, waiting to see his daughter. At the prosecution table, Spencer Vaughan arranged his files and felt good. He did not notice the old man. He was thinking about the case, about the reporters, about the way this morning was going to look on the record he was building toward the office he wanted. He stood with everyone else when the bailiff came out, and he barely listened to the words, because he had heard them 1,000 times. "All rise," the bailiff said. "Court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Yvette Coleman presiding." And the door beside the bench opened, and the woman in the black robe walked out. It was her. And in the third row, an old man in a church suit made a small sound that nobody else noticed. The sound a person makes when a thing they had stopped believing they would ever see is suddenly standing in front of them. Because Samuel Coleman had walked into that courtroom carrying the worst day of his life in his chest. 40 years of it, the smell of it, the sound of his own voice saying guilty. And now the door by the bench had opened, and out had come not a memory, but his daughter in a robe, climbing the steps to the highest seat in a room, exactly like the one that had broken him. And the old wound and the new pride collided in him so hard that he had to grip the bench in front of him with both trembling hands. It was her. Spencer Vaughan's face did the thing that a face does when the floor of the world tilts underneath it. Every drop of color left it. His mouth opened slightly. He looked at the woman ascending to the highest seat in the room, the woman he had told 40 minutes earlier that her kind of business got handled downstairs, and his own words came back to him all at once, in her voice and in his, and he understood, in a single horrible rush, exactly who he had just tried to send to the first floor. Judge Yvette Coleman sat down. She arranged her robe. She looked out over that courtroom, calm as still water. And her eyes passed over the gallery and found, in the third row, an old man in a church suit whose face had just cracked wide open with a pride so large it looked almost like grief. And she held her father's eyes for one single second, and something passed between them that 40 years had been waiting for. And then she turned unhurried to the prosecution table, and she looked at Spencer Vaughan. "Counselor," she said. Her voice was even and pleasant, and it filled the room. "Are you all right? You look a little pale." And Spencer Vaughan, on his feet, opened his mouth, and no sound came out. She let him stand in it for a moment, not cruelly, but she let the whole room feel the silence, because there are lessons that only silence can teach. And then she did the thing that told everyone in that courtroom exactly what kind of judge she was going to be, the kind her father never got. She did not destroy him. She could have. She had every right to, and the power to do it, and no one in that room would have blamed her. Instead, she said simply, "We met this morning, Mr. Vaughan, in the hallway. I don't think the introduction quite took. Let's try it again, on the record, so there's no confusion going forward. I am Judge Yvette Coleman. This is my courtroom. And in here, every person, every single one, is exactly who they are, and not who someone decided they were on sight." She let that land. "Do we understand each other, Counselor?" And Spencer Vaughan, ashen, whispered, "Yes, Your Honor, perfectly." She did not say another word about the hallway. She did not need to. Everyone in that room who had been paying attention understood exactly what had happened, and the ones who had not would hear about it before lunch. And either way, the point had been made without her ever having to spend her power to make it. That was the thing Spencer Vaughan would spend a long time trying to understand afterward, lying awake with it. She had held every card. She could have humiliated him into the floorboards, on the record, in front of the reporters, and it would have been fair, and it would have felt good, and it would have made her exactly the thing the world kept trying to tell her she was. A person who used a moment like a weapon, and she had simply declined to. She had corrected him cleanly, and then she had gone back to work, and the restraint of it was somehow heavier than any punishment, because it made him understand that she was operating at a level he had not known was in the room. She ran that hearing scrupulously, beautifully, fairly. She gave the prosecution every courtesy the law required, and not 1 inch more than it deserved. She was, to the defendant before her, a poor young man with a public defender, more careful and more patient than anyone in that room had ever seen a judge be, because she knew, better than any of them, exactly what it was to be the frightened person at that table with no money and the wrong face and the easy answer already written above your head. She made them prove it. She made them prove all of it. She was the fair face on the high seat, and her father watched every minute of it from the third row, with tears running silently down into his collar. An old man watching his daughter be at last. The thing that had not existed on the worst day of his life. The consequences arrived in the order such things do. What happened in that hallway did not stay in that hallway. Because the young clerk named Bailey, the one who had said Mr. Vaughan, I don't think, and been waved off, could not live with her own silence, and she reported what she had seen in writing to the presiding judge and to the bar. And Spencer Vaughan, the ambitious young prosecutor with his eye on higher office, found that the story of the ADA who tried to send a sitting judge downstairs because he assumed a black woman must be a defendant was not the kind of story that helps a career. There was a formal review of his conduct. The office he wanted did not want him back. And the video, because part of it had been caught on the courthouse hallway camera, was watched within a week, more times than that courthouse had heard cases in a decade. But Judge Coleman did not gloat, and she did not celebrate. And when she was asked about it by a reporter, she said only one thing, and it is the thing that traveled the furthest. She said, "That young man is not unusual." He said out loud what a great many people let themselves think in silence every single day, in courtrooms and classrooms and lobbies all over this country. And the reason it matters is not that he was cruel to me. I'm a judge, I'm fine. It matters because he decides every day which human beings this system believes, and he had just shown all of us how he decides. There are men and women sitting in cells right now because of a glance exactly like the one he gave me. That is the story, not me, them. And then Judge Yvette Coleman went and did the thing that mattered more than any of it. She left the courthouse that evening, and she took her 78-year-old father to dinner. And she sat across a table from the gentle, honest man who had once been made to say a word he did not mean in a building he could not bear to enter. And she told him what she had never quite told him in all these years. She told him that she became a judge because of what they did to him, that every case she had ever been careful with, every frightened person she had ever made them prove it for, was for him, that his name, the only thing he ever truly owned, the thing they took from him in an afternoon, had built the whole of his daughter's life and had, through her, given back to a great many other people the fair hearing he never got. "Daddy," she said, "you didn't lose your name that day. You gave it to me, and I have been spending it carefully ever since." Samuel Coleman, 78 years old, put his weathered hand over his daughter's hand, the way his own father might have, and he could not speak for a while. And when he could, all he said was, "I always knew what you were, baby." He was quiet. I just never thought I'd live to see them have to know it too. Yvette Coleman sat on that bench for many years. She became known in that city as the judge you wanted if you were poor and frightened and telling the truth, and the judge you did not want if you were powerful and lying, which is exactly the reputation an 11-year-old girl had once set out to earn. She never forgot a single defendant's name. She made a particular point of it, of learning the name and saying it right, because she knew what a name was and what it cost to have one taken, and what it meant to have one finally spoken with respect from the high seat. Here is what stays with me about this one. Yvette Coleman walked into that courthouse carrying 30 years of proof of exactly who she was. It was in her bearing, in her bag, on the brass plate on her own door, in the robe waiting on its hook. And a man looked at her face for half a second and decided the entire story. The same way another set of men had decided her father's story on a loading dock 40 years before, without evidence, without a question, without once bothering to learn a name. The proof was everywhere. He simply could not see it, because he had already made up his mind before she opened her mouth. That is almost always how it works. Not with a mob. With a patient sigh and a hand pointed toward the elevator, and a young clerk with an armful of files who feels that something is wrong and gets waved into silence. and a whole system full of people who decide who you are on sight and call it common sense. Only this time the person they filed away had spent her whole life earning the right to file back. In the end, I made Yvette and Samuel up, but I did not invent the man on the loading dock who said guilty because his innocence was worth less than the risk of proving it. That happened, and it happens to real people every single day, and a great many of them never got a daughter who spent 40 years turning their wound into a robe. A lot of you know a Samuel. Some of you are a Samuel. And a lot of you have been the clerk in the hallway too. The one who saw the thing that was wrong and felt the words rise up and swallowed them. Because the person doing the wrong had the power and you did not. So let me ask you honestly, if you had been in that hallway, watching a man wave a woman toward the elevator because he had decided what her face meant, would you have hurried past with your files? Or would you have been the one who said, "Sir, I don't think that's right"? And whose name are you about to decide you already know today before they have said a single word to you? Tell me below. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who was ever told their business gets handled downstairs. And remind them that the truth is patient, and that sometimes the person you sent to the back of the room walks in through the front and sits down at the top of it.